Hello, you're listening to PSGR and my name's Jodie Brunning. Today I'm going to roughly run through a presentation just given to the Ministry for Primary Industries on increasing maximum residue levels. PSGR's response to this consultation simply concerned glyphosate, glyphosate-based herbicides which include Roundup. And I started the presentation with a quote from Professor David Michaels. Our regulatory system is a response to these market failures. The objectives of the laws and the agencies empowered to enforce them is not only to stop the damage and prevent future harm, it is to maintain and strengthen the free market system. Law and regulation are the underpinnings of our economic system. Without the regulatory apparatus of the state, our modern economy could not exist. I want you to look at the EFSA representative uses, the European Food Safety Authority representative uses. Now, if you look through just on this single page, you can see the approvals are for pre-sowing, pre-planting and pre-emergence. They're for post-harvest and they're for inter-row applications. And then they're also for ground-directed, fully shielded spraying in orchards. EFSA also permit train spray applications on railway tracks and post-emergence spot treatment applications in vegetables and brassicas and so on. If you look there, you do not see urban environments. You do not see any approvals, representative uses in urban environments, and you don't see representative uses as a pre-harvest, a desiccant drying down spray on cereal crops, including wheat, oats, and barley. And it's a reasonably normal concept that you would dry down a crop before you harvest it and mill it to get it to a fully ripened stage. But Europe doesn't encourage that. Individual countries can turn around and they can absolutely approve it against European sort of principles, but just please understand that that is not the norm in Europe. Here's an example of a label in New Zealand. This is not the only label that says this. So Orion AgriScience Glyphosate 360 says that for broadacre crops, wheat, barley, oats and threshing peas can be used to control weeds prior to cultivation or prior to harvest. Spray 7 to 12 days prior to harvest when the grain moisture is less than 30%, and do not harvest within 7 days after spraying. Do not spray under sown crops and do not spray crops that will be harvested for seed. So this shows us that the label permissions for the everyday farmer gives them permission to spray as a desiccant drying down agent on animal food and human feed. The New Zealand use patterns, therefore, are far more lax than Europe. So the New Zealand EPA will say that we have similar restrictions, but it's actually quite different. And it's culturally okay to talk about glyphosate. It's much more difficult to get exposure in the media criticising it. So there are media barriers to discussing glyphosate locally, but we're increasingly seeing household use, that we're seeing bans in France, Belgium, Netherlands and Germany, which will be at the end of 2025, Austria, increasing bans in public areas, but also a shift away, a cultural shift away from public areas. And then there are nationwide bans that are happening as well. And so the question is why and how? In New Zealand, we have farmers, and I'm talking most particularly about small and medium-sized farmers, because we want to protect our farmers, ensure that they can pay the mortgage, that their margins, their cost margins work. And so it's the conversation with MPI centred around protecting farmers, but they're adrift because they often see themselves as having no other choice, yet they're facing herbicide resistance. This includes in wild carrot and ryegrass. They're spraying tank mixes, for example, with metsulfuron methyl and adjuvants. Now, the Foundation for Arable Research advice is to ensure a rotation of these tank mixes to prevent the increasing risk of herbicide resistance. But also New Zealand has permitted high concentrations of glyphosate, 600 grams per litre, and that's not permitted in the European Union. And the idea of integrative pest management, or the practice of IPM, that is not something that is broadly integrated in farmer education. It's not something that's broadly funded by the New Zealand government. So individual sectors such as horticulture or arable, so cropping and vegetable growing and pasture, will have different ideas on what best practice is. But the concept of what best practice is versus low chemical use and integrative pest management is not clear in New Zealand. So what we see, if you look at the central bar here, MB, the New Zealand EPA, MPI and the ESR, the EPA are ignoring broader use permissions, and so New Zealand is more lax. They have never done a risk assessment. So we are seeing a breakdown of good process. We see that MPI deliberately excluded from the 2024 New Zealand Total Diet Study for infants and toddlers glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is broadly detected in staple foods in the Total Diet studies coming in from Australia. And we know that infants and children consume more by body weight per day. So therefore, they will have higher exposures than adults. So MPI are tending to test for food that are exported, but they're not so good at looking at what the domestic market is exposed to. And we know that the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment's science policy has created broad restrictions around funding for scientists, particularly in agricultural research, to monitor and understand the risk from chemicals used in agriculture. And this risk involves risk to farmers, to the soil, and to runoff and to surrounding communities. So this can explain to you why there are no pesticide scientists that have been researching harm and risk from pesticides for the long term in New Zealand. Those science pathways simply are not there. As well as that, we have the underfunding of the New Zealand EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority, and so they delegate, they defer to the applicant data. They do not look at the weight of evidence in the scientific literature. And it's important to recognise that a lot of our cereals consumed on the North Island come from Australia. And the 25th Australian Total Diet Study really does show how pervasive glyphosate is, if you look in the appendices, are across those staple food groups, particularly the cereals. So we have in New Zealand, if you look on the right-hand side, a research failure. But you can't criticise it because there's no scientists. So it becomes lay people criticising this situation to government, and government say, well, there's no scientists. It's quite a nasty sort of self-perpetuating cycle. So we've been very late to detect and address resistance. And the Crown Research Institute, the CRI Ag Research, only in the last maybe 4 or 5 years came to realise the extent of the problem. They thought there was a 5% maybe resistance problem of particular weed species in crops, and they found that was 50% of the farms they went to, they found resistance. So they're now doing more work, but it's very late in the game. Please understand that herbicide resistance, you can look at Tony Heap's resistance website called weedscience.org, and that will give you some indication of the extent to which resistance to chemical herbicides is a really big problem. So the concept of the herbicide treadmill doesn't really work when all you're doing is using more and more chemical mixtures and adjuvants. You can see a term here called extension services. That's when scientists have the funding and resources to research best practice agriculture. They can do basic research, they can do literature searches to understand what the new science is, and then they would feed that through mediating channels, perhaps science educated people or retired farmers, to farming communities. And this wasn't just in particular one particular sector. It could often interact across all sectors that might have similar problems and similar challenges, such as pesticide resistance. In New Zealand, part of the research failure means that we don't talk about the data on occupational illness. So the sprayers that are contracting for local councils, the farmers that are spraying. Now, of course, a dairy farmer will do spot spraying, but may not spray as much as a horticultural or an arable crop farmer. We don't have central coordination for arable, pasture and horticulture for long-term research for issues such as this. And as a result, because we haven't identified glyphosate being harmful, we don't want to talk about it. The EPA doesn't do risk assessment and says if you follow best practice in wearing your protective gear, you'll be safe. But because they're failing to actually regulate or do risk assessment, we also have a lack of vision in developing the innovations, the technologies that can deal with that. So we could, if we had a freer science community that could undertake basic research to really understand the problem, we would then start looking in greater detail at the potential for robotics, for machine learning, for maths geeks, for sensor technologies, all to come together to develop really great innovations that we could retail. But at the moment, we're tending to look at innovations coming out of Europe because they've been faster to regulate. Please understand that even if you wear the equipment that the NZEPA is safe and that Monsanto and Bayer and all the other industry organisations, including CropLife, say is safe, that does not mean that farmers will not be exposed. So we know that applicators using handheld sprays or backpacks are much more exposed than operators in sealed tractor cab environments. Now, contamination to sprayers comes through the overalls, and it particularly comes to the chest, the forearms and the legs. And we know that overalls can wear thin from use, leading to more exposure through these pathways and during disrobing when they get home. We have dermal exposures from mobile phone use, from the steering wheel and from pesticide product containers. So of course, farmers and sprayer applicators will take their gloves off to drive a vehicle, to answer the phone, and they are primary routes of exposure. So we have natural face touching, and that increases the vulnerability to contamination. The protective gloves kept in public workspaces can be pre-contaminated by other workers, and reusable gloves can be more highly contaminated than disposable gloves. So you can see the references below there. Now, the court transcripts, particularly for the Piliad trial in the USA, were really important. They demonstrated that Monsanto understood that the risks through dermal exposures were far more extreme and long-lived than that regulators had previously understood. Now, this came out during the discovery process in the court case. So the skin epidermis acts as a reservoir holding chemicals which are then exuded over time, lengthening exposure time. We know that urine testing to predict exposures to farmers excluded the greater quantities in feces, effectively limiting estimation of farming family exposures. So that came out in the Piliad trial. Upward trends in exposure, the higher body burdens of children, particularly in rural regions, but there's a paucity of studies to examine glyphosate levels in greater depth. Now, generally exposed workers in horticulture then transport pesticides to households. Detections of urine of urban populations have a very strong association with pre-harvest desiccation. If we look at Europe, there was a lot of studies coming out showing the increase in urban population exposures, and that probably led to Europe being quicker to move glyphosate off staple food crops. So New Zealand is late to ID pesticide resistance. So the ag research team, including Zachary Now, Trevor James, Christopher Buddenham and Deborah Hackel, it's really worth looking up those studies. And as I said, the initial study thought resistance would be 5% of farms, but it was in 50% of farms. Now, what New Zealand EPA did, which PSGR we believe is rather disingenuous, they put out a call for information instead of doing risk assessment. And a lot of the sprayers and perhaps the horticultural industry sent in very simple submission that said glyphosate helps prevent herbicide resistance. The EPA then released a report on the call for information, and that said, as a subtitle for a section, glyphosate helps prevent herbicide resistance. It did not talk about glyphosate being the most used herbicide in New Zealand, so glyphosate promoting herbicide resistance. And then the New Zealand EPA did not then talk about what happens when farmers are trying to deal with resistance and use tank mixes with many modes of action, because the New Zealand EPA have never undertaken research to address the toxicity of tank mixes. When regulators do this, they have to look at persistence, how long this will remain, the extent of toxicity, the pathways to risk, and the potential for bioaccumulation. New Zealand EPA have never done this. So sort of blithely thinking that glyphosate helps prevent herbicide resistance so we can't regulate is quite disingenuous. So we know that dermal exposures on applicators are common despite good practice, and that it persists for far longer. So this is called the pesticide treadmill. And the way to get off this is to shift as much as possible, not always, but as much as possible, towards low chemical or no chemical agriculture. So we can see on this slide, at the moment, the Environmental Law Initiative, eli.org, have got the New Zealand EPA in court as I speak, on the 17th of June. They're in the High Court because ELI are taking the New Zealand EPA to court for never having conducted risk assessment of glyphosate. How did the NZEPA get away with this? They grandfathered in glyphosate many years ago. Then they've undertaken constant re-evaluations, and those happen when the applicant, for example, Syngenta, Shemanova, Monsanto, Bayer, New Farm, send in their studies. But what you need to keep an eye on is what the primary endpoints are for the acceptable daily intakes, the ADIs. So the primary difference for New Zealand EPA for the last 20 years has been WHO, FAO, World Health Organization and Food and Agricultural Organization joint meeting on pesticide residues endpoints. So as a consequence of no risk assessment and the underfunding because of MBI's science policy, we don't in New Zealand have residue testing to assess persistence. There's no testing of exposures in applicators. This includes agricultural soil contamination, the persistence in urban environments, waterways spraying when you have the persistence, particularly, for example, the metabolite of glyphosate, AMPA, that will persist in sediment. And remember that the sediment of the waterways is a place that starts the food chain. So the health of a water system is dependent on a healthy biome that is in that subsurface layer in the sediment. And as well as this, in farmers and applicators, the blood and urine levels are unknown. Now, it is actually much easier to test your livestock for contamination than it is to test humans for contamination of these pesticides. So NZEPA and the New Zealand government stepped away from monitoring. They ceased documenting the tonnages of pesticides in 2008, 2009. The MBIE's funding for science from 2015 really cut out all avenues for independent long-term research on the drivers of harm and the risks from human activities in the New Zealand environment and to health. And as well as that, New Zealand EPA just simply doesn't require feedback from health data or New Zealand scientists. So if there is a gap in the data, NZEPA don't turn around and say, hey, you scientists working at Ag Research or working at the Centre for Public Health Research, please can you do these studies? They simply don't seem to have that initiative. Now, glyphosate is a recognised occupational hazard, but unfortunately we don't see the ACC sending out reports and advising on this, but the global scientific literature really does inform us. The decision in 2015 by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, that are based in Lyon, they found that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic, and definitely in the animal studies that they looked at, it was definitely carcinogenic. So there is a definite risk for NHL, for multiple myeloma. But we're seeing increasing evidence across all the different sort of pathways that glyphosate exerts harm across the body systems. So we're seeing evidence of organ toxicity, your liver, your kidney, blood, cardiovascular and breathing. We're seeing microbiome risks. So you're seeing an increase in digestive and colon cancers, but you're also seeing glyphosate was always known to disrupt the Shikimate pathway, which is a plant-based pathway in the gut. Now we know from long-term evidence that long-term use of herbicides is strongly associated with mental illness. Then we also have the problem that glyphosate is a chelator, however you want to say it, of minerals. So it will bind with minerals that we need to be bioavailable, such as magnesium or manganese. So when you have less of these minerals available, you have less capacity to integrate these minerals as cofactors in the production of proteins and hormones. And that's a very, very basic way of describing it. As well, just recently, Panzacchi et al. Published a marvellous paper called The Carcinogenic Effects of Long-Term Exposure from Prenatal Life to Glyphosate and Glyphosate-Based Herbicides in Sprague-Dawley rats. They conducted a study that followed pretty closely to the protocols demanded by regulators. So the parent generation was dosed, the next generation was dosed, and they looked at the evidence of cancer in those offspring as well as the parent generation. Huge numbers, about 1,000 rodents in the overall trial, and they did not dismiss tumours because they thought that wasn't connected to the treatment, and they did not dismiss tumours because they believed it was associated with histopathological records, but they had a control group that they compared against. Now, this is an excellent, robust study. A lot of very senior professors involved, so they're being very particular about it, and it's really worth looking at. I would like to bring your attention to the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. This work is done in Geneva, unlike the IARCs, which is done in Lyon. In 2004, this is a very long time ago, they conducted toxicological evaluations. They found the 1 milligram per kilogram body weight a day acceptable daily intake. But what then happened is when the 2016 evaluations ran around, they deferred to the same ADI, to the same studies. So what we see is the acceptable daily intake proof or evidence is based on old data that is private, unpublished industry studies. This can include Monsanto, Shemanova, Syngenta. You need to understand that the WHO drinking water standards, which is also the New Zealand drinking water standards, are drawn from these really old studies. So it's a 1980s Monsanto study that gives you your safe levels of glyphosate in drinking water. And of course, those studies never looked at the full toxicity of the full formulation. I conducted an Official Information Act request because the ESR in New Zealand did the re-evaluation of the drinking water standards in 2018. Now, the scientists that had responsibility for re-evaluating, it was a very short, maybe 3-month work period. They had very limited funding. So that is why they simply drew from the WHO FAO data and they didn't conduct a literature review. And when they re-evaluating the drinking water standards, of course, this was for all pesticides. There was no way they were going to independently look at the data separate from the FAO and WHO levels. So New Zealand EPA have never evaluated whether the current levels are safe based on the weight of evidence in the scientific literature. They defer to the ADI approach from the WHO and FAO, and they sit on that. Many people understand the bomb that was thrown into the glyphosate controversy in 2015 when the International Agency for Research in Cancer found or determined that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic. The IARC used publicly available data in the scientific literature and government white papers. Now you can see that on the IARC website in the preamble. So the IARC do not set ADI levels, they look at cancer risk. After the IARC published this in their monograph, the New Zealand EPA's response was to conduct a review of the evidence relating to glyphosate and carcinogenicity by Wayne Temple. That was published about 2017. Now, Temple only looked at the industry studies to prove safety for cancer, and Temple's work was peer-reviewed by insiders in the regulatory agencies. At about the same time, or just after, I worked with Green MP Stephen Browning to produce a paper called Public Health Concern. And that was where we came to that understanding that the New Zealand EPA, the Temple paper, had relied on that industry supplied data. We published that paper, and the only way we could get that paper approved by the Green Party, because it was controversial, was to get a bunch of New Zealand scientists to actually say that this paper that we were producing was legitimate. And we did. This included then IARC scientist Andrea Tomanici. And it also included the scientists that then 1 year later published the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. Why is New Zealand's EPA lost in the weeds? That was published in the New Zealand Medical Journal. That NZMJ paper called for the New Zealand EPA review to be withdrawn and for the NZEPA to accept the IARC's conclusion that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. Now, the New Zealand EPA absolutely ignored that paper by those very senior scientists, including professors and at least 2 or 3 epidemiologists. New Zealand EPA have also excluded the data disclosures in the discovery processes in the global court cases. And so here I refer back to the dermal toxicity of glyphosate. So the New Zealand EPA failed, and I conducted an Official Information Act request on this. The New Zealand EPA failed to come together to convene after the IARC announced their finding, after millions and billions of dollars had been found in favour of plaintiffs in particularly the US court cases. They still hadn't convened. Their subcommittee had not convened. Now, I had tried to get this into the accredited media, but they had rejected this information. So I was not able several years ago, maybe 2019, to let the New Zealand public know this. So there was still no risk assessment, and that is the basis of the current High Court challenge with Eli. What is also important to understand is that glyphosate is not just an active ingredient. It also is applied with adjuvants, with co-formulants, but the adjuvants can also increase the toxicity. And the actual active ingredient in the formulation may only be 360 grams per litre or up to 600 grams, which is New Zealand's terrible highest level. So when that was reverse engineered, that to find out what also is in those formulations, this is Defarge et al. 2018. They also identified by mass spectrometry the heavy metals arsenic, chromium, cobalt, lead and nickel, which are known to be toxic and endocrine disruptors, as contaminants in 22 pesticides, including 11 glyphosate-based ones. So the New Zealand EPA is avoiding looking at the formulation mixtures, and that was part of the rejection of the IARC decision, because they also looked at the formulations. But then we also have the persistent breakdown metabolites such as AMPA and the heavy metals which can persist in soils. So what we would like to recommend is a pivoting to stewardship, because New Zealand EPA and the whole of government, the MPI, ESR, Ministry of Health, have not stewarded glyphosate and its co-formulants in such a way that protects health. We would like to recommend a ban on retail sales and use in urban environments. We would like a straight out ban on the high concentration products, e.g. the 600 grams per litre, which increase dermal risk, and shift to the same concentration levels used in Europe. We would like a transition away, a ban from crop desiccation on human food and animal feed. The science, the failure of basic research, basic science for agriculture, even though $54 billion in agricultural products are exported, it's a terrible thing. Because what we see is the public being angry with farmers, but farmers not seeing how else to shift and not having other tools in the toolkit. But we also see a lack of evidence. The public kind of know because they look at the international literature, but locally, the regulators and the decision makers and the farmers, that information does not come to hand, and therefore it is not published by media. When glyphosate distributors advertise on the front page of agricultural newspapers and carry half-page advertisements, there's unlikely to be extensive criticism of glyphosate in the agricultural newspapers that do try to do a good job. We can demand long-term science funding for occupational monitoring and analysis, for residue and soil contamination, for integrative pest management, IPM, non-chemical weed management, to shift use to less chemically intensive agriculture. We can see long-term funding for really exciting innovation and technology in robotics, machine learning, tech development for weed control. Now, these sort of products need to be really robust, really tolerant for moisture, drought, rocks in the way. So they need to be really sophisticated. And this is a really good way of harnessing science through interdisciplinary research. We also can look at cropping alternatives that suit New Zealand conditions in a changing climate. For example, more drought-tolerant varieties, but also more varieties perhaps seen in the north of Europe, such as rye flowers that may be a bit more tolerant to greater humidity and rain. But that work has not been done to a meaningful long-term level because the different agricultural sectors, for example, the Foundation for Arable Research, have limited funding, and often they just have to look at the most urgent challenges. They can't go on and do long-term research because MB is not supplying that money. So we can recognise what best practice in Europe is. So warmer climates have there are different effects on herbicides once they're sprayed into the environment versus colder, wetter climates. So you'll see greater persistence in colder climates most likely. So European decisions are also based around preventing groundwater contamination. The only long-term research in New Zealand is on groundwater contamination. That's by the ESR. But the ESR simply report their findings. They don't research the toxicity, for example, in forestry areas, what happens to that groundwater when it has accumulating mixtures of herbicides and other additive ingredients, or the runoff, for example, into the Rotorua lakes, into sediment from those forestry applications that might persist for longer because, of course, the metabolites will sit there for a longer time in a dark subsoil environment. But that's also the same problem in other agricultural regions. For example, if you're using a lot of sprays in environments that really can't tolerate or degrade pesticides. But then, of course, there's many heavy metals that simply don't tend to degrade and they bioaccumulate instead. So in point 6 there, they made a political decision not to monitor glyphosate in infant and children's food in that total diet study. And that is a moral failure because small children consume more per body weight because they eat more over the day, and they also end up sort of touching and being around and putting their hands in their mouth more. So if their parents are bringing pesticides home on their work gear, the small children will be more exposed to that, including even what goes through the washing machine or what the residues in the washing machine. We need a whole of government approach, and MPI, when we gave this presentation, said that many people had said this because New Zealand has not had a whole of government approach to stewardship. They've had a whole of government approach to basically preventing the rising up of information that sort of demonstrates the weight of evidence on glyphosate. New Zealand can invest in non-chemical weed management. We can take an interdisciplinary scientific approach that supports arable, hort, pasture and viticulture. The Centre for Public Health Research, those scientists have told me that they have to get testing overseas because our commercial labs won't traverse a lot of the chemicals they look to covering. We need permanent labs that are resourced in our academic institutions, our CRIs. There should not be barriers to monitoring glyphosate levels in water, in groundwater, in soil and in human, whether it's urine or blood. And right now there is massive barriers to getting that tested. Now we know that NZEPA have completely and utterly failed. They've stepped away from risk assessment. Their risk assessment methodology is extremely poor. It doesn't give officials any direction on a precautionary approach. But there's no language in the New Zealand EPA, even though it's in their legislation. And what we see in the methodology is no weighting of looking at the weight of evidence in the scientific literature. So that then turns the whole of risk assessment back to the applicant. And then we also see a habit to defer to other regulators. But if the other regulators are as poorly regulated as New Zealand, it becomes this sort of race to the bottom. As I have just previously discussed, the ESR, they're detecting classes of pesticides in groundwater, such as the triazine class, but there is no research to understand bioaccumulation or class-based risks. They should be funded. Should have the autonomy to do this research. And we also see a failure in the ACC to analyse and disclose occupational diseases and conditions. And we see a corresponding failure in the Ministry of Health to chase that down and to actually publicly disclose, particularly if we can look at sort of agricultural communities, occupational associations with these conditions. People have higher levels of cancer in their digestive tract. We're seeing earlier stage cancer, for example, leukemia, in children at higher rates than in our ancestors. The Panzacchi paper drew attention to the evidence for leukemia. Now, not all of this I did mention to the MPI. I mentioned 95% of it. They were really open to my presentation. I'm really hoping that we're going to see more work across New Zealand that will involve a whole of government approach to stewardship for pesticides, not only glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides, because New Zealand soils deserve it, our waterways deserve it, our children, our families deserve it, our farmers deserve it, and we will benefit from this in the export markets that demand the highest calibre, premium, clean foods, because the global market recognises that premium foods are undergoing a resurgence. Commercial, generic processed foods have a very low CAGR, compound annual growth rate, of about 5-6%, whereas premium foods and organics are up at 12% and more. And biohacking, if you look at the evidence for nutrients, high quality nutrient supplements, that's up at 18%. There's huge demand because people are reversing illness. They're moving to clean food. Our government departments that have been asleep at the wheel for a very long time can reverse that. We can rev out of this with all cylinders blaring. So thank you very, very much for listening.